Cool. Hi guys, I'm Stuart Stevenson. I'm the developer at rightmove.co.uk, property website. I'd like to give a talk today on some of the lessons we learned and some of the challenges we faced when integrating consumer-driven contracts into our delivery pipeline. I'll just start off with, anybody not know what a consumer-driven contract is? Cool. Comes up a lot with the microservices. We've been moving to microservices since 2014. I say think about them as a unit test to assert that provider applications meet the expectations of their consuming services. So you've got a consumer-provider relationship between two services, like a specification for what the API looks like, what structure the data is returned in, and be able to use those specifications to automate tests, write tests throughout them, and automate that. So it's really good when both consumer and provider within a closed service. Some material we used, Martin Fowler's webpage, great article on consumer-driven contracts there. Sam Newman's Building Microservices book covers that in the testing section. And our Australian counterparts, realestate.com.au, have been microservices since 2009. They've been moving over, and they've open sourced a whole framework called Pact. There's a load of tooling around that. And there's some great articles on their GitHub page about the sort of developer interactions and the more communication side of things that are involved as well. So some context for Rightmove. So we began going to continuous delivery and microservices at the same time, 2014, so they're very bound together for us. Most of our services are internally consumed. We don't really provide many external services, so we don't have that constraint on how our services work. We opted not to version APIs and use consumer-driven contract testing to maintain backwards compatibility between releases. And just so you know, we have a bit of a JVM preference in-house. That's where most of our knowledge lies. So for us, our initial challenges, we don't have a lot of history of services, SOA. So we started off having lots of theoretical discussions around new words like contract and pact. For us, it was very theoretical and led for a lot of new language, and people weren't sure what these words meant. And the big challenge in terms of pipelines for us was to make sure we've got a consuming service, which is going to create some contracts and specifications that we then want to test against our providing services. And we've got some providing services that are going to publish some artifacts that we then want to run those tests against. So we're trying to have two separate pipelines for our different services. How do we make sure we're not coupling our releases? How do we make sure that we don't tie them together? We're able to release them independently, and how do you how do we automate all the orchestration around that? Our approach was just to make things simpler. We thought, okay, let's just work through this on paper and just draw some diagrams. So these are my initial spec diagram, like design diagrams from 2014. So please don't judge me. But visualizing the process helped us identify actually what the steps were going to be. So we need to publish something to some broker that's going to manage this. We're going to need to, when we run our CDC stage in our pipeline, when we actually verify the tests, we want to make sure we download the contracts and we download our artifact that we can spin up and run the contracts against. By visualizing all this, it made it really clear what we needed to automate. Cool. So we started off by doing the provider, because for us, if you're a service that's providing a service, you want to verify all the different consuming contracts against you. So there's only one thing to spin up. In the second stage, when you're a consuming service, if you're consuming lots of different services, lots of different providers, you want to spin each one of those up and test against them. So it's a little bit more complicated. Notice it's slightly different. By doing this process, we realized because they're different, if you have a service that is a consumer and a provider, they're two mutually exclusive workflows, which has made life easy, helped us realize that we weren't going to have to write any custom logic, any custom workflows into our pipeline, so they could just chop and change and they could run in whatever order they wanted to. So our first spike was we opted to use Pact. It seemed like a good option out there. There's an open source Pact Broker, a Ruby application. So we just spun up some basic services, tested it out in Jenkins. We were reasonably happy. Our first lessons were we found that the Pact Broker didn't have all the endpoints we wanted in terms of being able to given a provider get all its contracts, those sorts of stuff. This was a year ago. Checked up on it yesterday. It's a lot more up to date than it was. When it came to have discussions about how we extended it, it was Ruby. We don't have a lot of Ruby knowledge, and for us it was quicker to just write our own little REST service to manage that. Pact uses a little JUnit library to let you create the contracts, and there's a Gradle plugin they have to take the contracts, this was just JSON documents, and verify them against an endpoint. And we found those were great. That's exactly what we wanted. But for us, what we didn't have was when our consuming services were generating these JSON documents, there was no automated way to upload them and to download them as well when we needed them. So next iteration, made sure we had our own little Restful Service managing those contracts for us, created our own Gradle plugin to automate all the orchestration of downloading contracts, uploading contracts. So we got to that point, and what we found then was, because we were doing this as we were learning how to do microservices, contracts were changing rapidly all the time. Things would get uploaded that were just not right. Just mistakes were being made, and people wanted to be able to really visualize relationship, so we just created a little Angular end on our service. As you can see, we've got really original names like property and property where, property management. That's our sort of services. It was a nice way to manage that. So, because I've done this for 5 minutes, so I'm kind of at the end. For us, our current challenges are, we don't have a lot of services, and what we're finding is if you have a team that owns a provider and a consuming services, of a consumer that consumes one of your own providing services, it's quite easy to change the provider first and just accept the contract's going to break. So that's one of our challenges at the moment. How do we, again, sort of more cultural side of things, how do we get that more embedded that you always change? It's consumer driven, the consuming contract, the consumers should define the change. One of the things we've come back and revisited again and again is making the provider services that we want to test against as lightweight as fast as possible. Because we want to automate all this testing, we want to make it as left shifted as left as possible. So we want those services to start up as fast as possible. However, we still want it to be the actual production code we're going to be testing, or as close, the actual production code. So stubbing out downstream dependencies, not really caring about the data we return. And the current status we're currently in is we are only testing these contracts against the current latest release candidate versions, so the ones that are building in pre-prod. We're currently working on building the system to test against current production and previous production for rollback. So there are current challenges, that's where we are. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions.